This week, we're back on track. Coming up on Worlds Asunder.
When you market out your books, when you're even if you're pitching it as a debut to sell to publishers or whatever, the things you are drawing on is your world building, right? Yeah. Like, especially in the science fiction and fantasy genre, the key is to stress how both what your book is like and how your book is different or unique or special. And for us, for genres that are part and parcel, where setting is character, which is what science fiction and fantasy are both doing, the world building is what readers gravitate.
The stories we've read capture our attention and immerse our minds in settings of all kinds to bring us the spectrum of feelings and deliver the tale of tales to our starving psyches.
Whether it's medieval-style fantasy with mages and knights,
or hard sci-fi takes on the future of space colonization,
or thrillers set in your backyard, world building is the foundation that holds up the narrative, the glue that keeps it from unraveling as readers follow the journey you laid out for them, all to make the stories jump from the pages and burn themselves into our memories.
Welcome, weary writers, to Book Career in a Year's network of podcasts. This is Worlds Asunder, an insightful podcast on world and character building.
My co-host is the one and only David Shadoin, better known as Shady. It's not just a descriptor, it's also his moniker.
And she's the H.Y. Gregor, but you can call her Haley or Sour Patch, your friendly post-apocalyptic wasteland elf.
We know. We have nearly a score of published novels and short stories between us, but who the hell are we to teach you about world building and character development? We get it, which is why we decided to call in some favors.
Each week, we pull from a list of the best and brightest authors, editors, and publishers to give tips and guidance on tackling the age-old questions and provide you with tools on how to accomplish world building like the pros. From environment to magic to characters, how do we strike a balance between what matters to our audiences and what matters to keep it all straight? Open up your ear holes
and your minds
and get ready for us to tear Worlds Asunder.
So, if you're ready,
just knock and enter. What's up, guys? Welcome to Worlds Asunder, yet another week of world building podcasts along with a winery.
We wish.
Now, I have wine, I just don't have the winery. Anyway.
I didn't know we were drinking. I should have brought booze.
Do you want to run?
You should have told me that. That was very important information.
We can stop right now.
We will wait.
We can stop right now, and you can go get booze if you want.
Yeah.
No, it's fine.
You met Kevin Eikenberry at Superstars? He makes a really, really amazing spicy margarita. So we interviewed him at his house with spicy margaritas, and it was phenomenal. So
that sounds great.
Yeah. So when we have you back on, we'll definitely get together and we'll drink more.
I mean, I should have known it's a conversation amongst writers. I should have known alcohol would be involved, but I was like, do I just show up with a drink in my hand? I wasn't sure how official you were being, and now I have a drink, but it's not alcoholic.
We've received no instruction, so
that's true. It's true. For those of you in the audience, if you want to pause this now and go get a drink, it's going to be a wild ride. Should be fun.
And we will become so much more intelligent if you are drunk. So please drink.
Exactly.
Thank you.
I like your style. So I am your host with the most, Shady David Shadoin. It's both a moniker and a descriptor. My co-conspirator, as always, is Haley H.Y. Gregor. Today, we've already kicked it off with a bang, but today we have a wonderful guest we're super excited to talk to. According to her bio, she writes books that are hugs, mostly comedies of manners mixed with steampunk, urban fantasy, and sci-fi, plus a little bit of cozy queer joy as Gail Carriger. These include things like the Parasol Protector, the Custard Protocol, Tinkered Stars, and San Andreas Shifter series for adults, and the Finishing School and the Tinkered Starsong series for young adults, which I just believe the final book is coming out here soon, if I remember right.
We're out.
Just came out.
It's done. That trilogy is in the bag.
Nice.
Yes.
It's always good. But also she has some nonfiction, primarily the heroine's journey and a couple of different books on speaking, I believe. Correct?
No, just the heroine's journey so far, and then I'm in the middle of writing my magnum opus on the business side of being an author and brand and stuff like that. But it's gotten a little out of hand, and I need to finish it. But yeah, mostly just the heroine's journey. I do a lot of speaking, in-person presentations and stuff, but just the one nonfiction book so far.
Gotcha. And I'll note this. While we probably won't get extensively into heroine's journey today, I did use that book extensively writing my first novel.
It's really good. Both
Yeah, it was,
your novel and the heroine's journey are both very good.
But so I was really excited to get to finally meet Gail when we were at Superstars. But she's published in many languages, has over 1 million books in print, over a dozen New York Times and USA Today bestsellers, has starred reviews in Publishers Weekly, Booklist, Kirkus, and the Romantic Times. She was once an archaeologist and is fond of shoes, cephalopods, and tea. Ladies and gentlemen, today our guest is the wonderful Gail Carriger.
Hi, everybody. Hello. It's going to be fun.
Oh, yeah. I'm so excited, especially having gotten to talk to you, and I've already mentioned it, gotten to talk to you at Superstars.
That was great. That was great. That hallway conversation lives on in my memory. That was a blast. It was one of those things where everybody else was off doing something, and like a little gaggle of us were just like in the hallway shooting shit. Just, oh, sorry.
No, I wasn't supposed to. We're only.
That's all right. It's all right. Don't need to monetize this one. It's not like we don't have enough. We don't have enough audience to monetize anyway.
God.
We're working
on
it.
It's all good.
The people that come to watch you,
not to swear until 10 minutes had passed.
But the people who you're going to draw who want to watch this, they know what to expect from you. So it's not a.
They do. Everybody knows. Like, I present all prim and proper, but I actually have terribly blue, as my mother would say. I don't have much of those things left to give, shall we say?
I'm just glad you did it first, because I thought for sure it was going to be me. One of these times I was going to bust it. Cool. But let's get right into it, though, right? Because we'll have plenty of time to have fun while we answer some good questions. I kind of started off the end of your intro there, but as an archaeologist, and I know you're a huge foodie, and you just have a general love of studying inanimate objects in general, and fashion. What do you think of those things? Like, is it a combination that informs you the most for your world building?
Yeah, I'm super driven. I'm super object driven. I think steampunk was a really natural nesting place for me as coming straight into being an author from being an archaeologist, because I'm very sort of invested in what objects say about the people who have them, and how the presence or absence of something like a magical system might influence the physicality of the world around it. An example I always use is if you have something like a medieval world, but you have wizards with projectile weaponry like fireballs or something, then the structure of your castles is going to be completely different. They're going to be like star-shaped or whatever, because they will have been built to accommodate a magical system. So the objects of the world are very much informed by your world building. So I think it's really important to think about this kind of stuff. And how your characters are going to move through that world and interact with all of the stuff around them is part and parcel, for lack of a better way of putting it, of how you have built it and what components you have put into it, whether it's science fiction or fantasy in particular. So that's for me, it was very important. So one of the things that I have is I have characters associated with objects. So the main character from my first series has a sort of Swiss Army knife parasol that she carries around with her everywhere. And that has to do with this. And that's kind of a representation of her personality. And the whole series is named the Parasol Protectorate because of that. But I chose it because it's a ubiquitous object that women of the Victorian era carried around with them all the time, that we no longer really use. So it's sort of a representative of the time period. It's a representative of a gender within that time period. And then that could be the thing I could then turn into a weapon that skews from the nested initial reality of the setting. So yeah, objects, very important to me.
Well, it even makes me think a little bit of like kind of a James Bond-esque object, or go one step further, Kingsman, right? They brought
Yes.
the umbrella knife back into play.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I even describe a character that's introduced in the second book in that series, Madame LeFou, as the Q for Alexia. So yeah, and I have a lot of spy characters in my world building as well. So definitely part of it. I was definitely thinking about, the parasol as a kind, and steampunk is so full of sort of whimsical gadgets. So it's super important that, for me anyway, because what people forget is that technically steampunk is in the sci-fi genre, is that the technology has to inform the story and the world building. For me, that's the difference between science fiction and fantasy and other forms of fiction, is that in sci-fi, if you remove the science fiction element, if you remove the futuristic technology from the book should fall apart, or it's not really sci-fi. And in fantasy, if you remove the world building, if you remove the magical system, then the book should fall apart. Like, everything should be hinging on the magical system and the characters inhabiting it. So to belong to that genre, in my brain anyway, that's how I've always defined it. So yeah, it's really important that these like whimsical, weird gadgetries be part of the fiber of the stuff that I wrote, especially when I'm writing steampunk.
Do you ever blend and lean more into like the gas lamp magic fantasy?
Sure, because I have paranormal creatures. The conceit of the universe for me is I put the supernatural creatures that the Victorians dealt with the most. So I took the Victorian era as the Romantic Gothic movement and the beginning of science fiction and fantasy as we know it in the Western world in particular. So all the tropes and archetypes were kind of established during that time period for us to then play with and continue to do so to this day. So there's something full circle to me about taking the sort of very monsters that they were obsessed with at the time and then making them real and making the impact of their presence be what has driven this technological difference that we see in a steampunk version of that reality. So the paranormal component kind of informed the steampunk component. So like dirigibles become really, really popular because vampires and werewolves are sort of tethered to the ground and to territory. So if you want to get completely away from them, you go to the skies, right? That kind of conceit. So where were we going with this? So yeah, so I do have these Gothic creatures in my steampunk, which came from the Gothics kind of concept. And then when I start moving my characters to a different part of the world, they start dealing with folkloric and creatures that are shapeshifters and bloodsuckers that all other cultures had, and we're dealing with that particular moment in time as well. So, because it turns out from an archaeological, historical sort of folklorist perspective, almost every culture in the world has some kind of shapeshifting manifestation and some kind of cadaver, undead, blood-sucking manifestation. So I just kept playing with those kind of two archetypes.
I really want to start a genre war, but we're not going to go there.
Yeah, I mean,
I love talking about that line.
The other line that I do is like the presence of the paranormal has steampunk consequences, but also all of the scientists all the Victorian scientists are attempting to explain and understand these monsters that are walking among them. So you have this all of this technology, including medical technology, etc., that's sort of creeping up, trying to figure out how they work and why they work and how you would survive if you tried to become one of them and things like that. Because to me, that's what would happen, right? Obviously, that's what would happen. But of course, they're all trying to understand it using the Victorian science of the day. So, which ties back to my archaeological background. Archaeology is a very young social science, and it has its roots in the Victorian era as well. So, that's I had to study it as part of my PhD program, the how my discipline began. And so understanding sort of scientific thought at that time period was also really sort of exciting and interesting for me. So then I gave them some vampires and werewolves to sort of deal with as part of their Victorian mindset, and like sat back and played around with it to see how it would work. So I don't really have a magical system. That's kind of where I've drawn the line so far as gaslight fantasy is concerned. So don't have like fae or fairies or magic or anything like that. I just have these monsters, which then the steampunk and the science is trying to cope with and understand and explain. I love that.
Yeah. So you've kind of already touched on it, but where did you exactly start when you came up with a series like the Parasol Protectorate? Because you've already mentioned, like the Victorian era has a lot of the scientific studies background that you were already in. So it seems like a fair place to start. But is that where you started, or did you just have a different idea entirely?
So, I mean, this is one of those things where I'm always like, when you're writing the beginning of a series, everybody out there, one of the things you should do is write where you get how you get your ideas and what order they come in, because people are going to ask you about this for the rest of your life. And I cannot remember what came first. It's a chicken and the egg situation for me. But I will say that I was noodling on the idea of apex predators. So the thing that there are several quandaries around vampires in particular. Like if you have immortals or the very long-lived amongst you, they have a very different mentality about humans, right? You become the prey and they are the apex predator, as opposed to us normally as apex predators, as humans on this planet. So this idea that there would be an apex predator above us is what happens the moment you have monstrosity introduced, especially in the guise of something like vampires who prey upon humans. And so I was like, okay, if we have an apex predator that can bite people and turn them into vampires, what is stopping the vampires from taking over the world, right? Like any other biological concern, there has to be a limiting factor. So there's a reason why mice and bunny rabbits outbreed hawks and lynxes and things like that, right? The higher you get up on the apex predator food chain, the harder it is for you to procreate, except us monkeys, but we don't really count anymore. So what is the limiting factor on the vampires and the werewolves if I have them? Like what keeps them from outbreeding and out fishing the food source, so to speak? So there must be a limit in place. And you impose that limit by making it incredibly difficult to turn somebody into a werewolf or a vampire. That becomes the thing that is hardest to do. Breeding becomes the hardest thing. And so how would scientists at the time explain this difficulty? And then I sort of started noodling about the idea that there's this prevailing notion that the undead, and in the Victorian era, vampires are a type of undead. They lose their soul. That's part of what makes them zombies or undead or whatever. And I was like, well, what if, in fact, in order to survive being bitten, you have extra soul? You have like excess soul. And so only the people who have more than their fair share of soul when they're bitten actually manage to survive it. But of course, you can't figure that out. You can't figure out when someone is a human running around how much soul they have, And so everybody's trying to figure it out, because if you could figure out whether you can survive the bite, then, you're more willing to take that risk or not. And so there's a theory in the Victorian era that it has to do with like creativity. And then this is just the way my brain works. And then I was like, well, of course, then vampires would become patrons of the arts, right? Like vampires are going to be like funding the theater scene and and everybody who manages to turn is going to have some sort of like artistic and creative background. But of course, you sacrifice that once it's your turn. So I have a bunch of like opera singers who are now werewolves or whatever, right? And it just kind of organically explained the whole Victorian like social structure of London in particular. Also, you have vampires running fashion, so everybody's obsessed with being very pale, and suddenly you have like high-necked dresses to hide bite marks and big, huge skirts to keep the vampires away, and you have all of this, like everything that is weird and crazy and insane about the Victorian era starts to be explained if you integrate the supernatural into that culture, if you're my brain, anyway. And so that's just what happened. And then, of course, I encountered people, because this is the time period when science and religion are still very much linked with each other. So I encountered a bunch of like Americans attempting to weigh the soul as people die, putting people into these huge slings and trying to weigh them to see on the moment of death if you actually lose weight. Stuff like that. And so it sort of all evolved from there. And that then gave me the idea that there would be one additional form of an apex predator, which is these preternaturals who prey, as in they prey on the supernaturals, and they have only one skill, and they are essentially humans with an absence of soul. So they have less than the normal amount of soul. So what they can do essentially is kind of suck the soul out. So they nullify supernatural creatures and they nullify their powers. So they could touch a vampire and that vampire would become human again. And they could touch a werewolf and the werewolf would be unable to change forms, that kind of thing. And that's what gave me my main character. I've always loved the idea of, I'm a Marvel girl, so I've always loved the idea of like Leech and some of the invented superheroes who exist simply like electrical grounds. They just cancel out powers. I've always thought that was a really cool power, to actually have no real power of your own, but just stop everybody else, like Rogue in a way. Yeah. So that's where Alexia kind of sprung into existence. And then I had this image of these two very proper Victorian women walking through Hyde Park together, casually complaining about the fact that one of them had accidentally killed a vampire the night before and how embarrassing that was. And the whole series sprung from there.
So, yeah, and you touched on it a little bit. So I did go and read Meet Cute, your short story, because I wanted to know, and that was one that you had pitched on your website that you had said, was kind of a story for your fans. And so yes,
that is a pure fan service. The one question, so when I wrote Soulless, I wrote Soulless to battle a lot of things like alpha masculinity and all of this other stuff. But one of the things I was battling was tropes, specifically romance tropes. And so I very, very consciously wrote a romantic arc for two characters who already knew each other. So you never get to see them meet for the first time. And I thought I was being terribly clever and having a grand old time. But the email I got for the next 10 years was, will you ever write the scene where Alexia and Connell meet for the first time? And because it's just alluded to. It's called the Hedgehog Incident. It's just alluded to. And so finally I was like, fine, I'll write that scene. And that's what that short story is for anybody who cares.
But it is a nice taste of what your series is about too, which is, a lot of what you've explained. But like when I first had read like, oh yeah, Soulless was one of the characters, I was thinking like much less cheery, much less Pride and Prejudice, and more like, oh, she is just a straight assassin. And then you find out that it's Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, that movie that came out.
She is in fact just the most practical human being on the planet. It turns out in my brain and universe, when you remove any sort of inclination towards creativity, you're just absolutely practical. So essentially I wrote her as the ultimate straight man upon which all of these crazy other characters and supernatural creatures can kind of bounce. And it's very fun to write that character because she never reacts the way anybody else would. Like, so some insane thing can happen and she'd be like, we should have some tea and talk about this. I know everything's just exploded. I know I've accidentally set half of London on fire. My bad. But let's have tea. And it makes for a really fun main character. So that is why Soulless has the cover it has, which of course it's the one book I don't have because I accidentally gave away all of my trade paperback editions. But here it is. They gave Soulless this cover with this very cheery slashed pink to really emphasize the fact that this is not as dark as perhaps this image might make you think. That what I write primarily, as much as we are talking about sci-fi, fantasy, and world building, is comedies of manners. I just happen to also love world building and science fiction and fantasy. So if I was going to write it, it had to exist in some sort of crazy alt universe. I keep trying to do things like write contemporary romance, and it just ends up full of gay werewolves, and I'm like, okay, well, I guess we're writing paranormal romance instead. Fine.
I started writing epic fantasy, and then I ended up with a best-selling paranormal romance series. I don't know how it happened. Dang.
Shucks.
You're not actually, you're not joking. Most of my trunk books are like hugely epic, like world building, epic fantasy type stuff, because I do love history and I do love world building. So, but then I was like, everybody buys humor from me. I was like, I better write a funny book. Careful, because then you end up writing funny books for the rest of your life.
I mean, do what you enjoy, and so long as it also makes you money, it's real nice, right?
Yeah, that's the secret of humor writing, especially in genre fiction, is it sells. If you can do it, it'll sell. Yeah. You won't win any awards. No Hugos for you, but some New York Times bestsellers if you're lucky.
Hey,
really, which one of those is putting food on the table?
A point I made to my publisher at a WorldCon after losing the Campbell Award.
I'm sure that went over.
I'll take the New York Times every day. Yeah. I'm not cut up about this. Thanks, but we're good.
7 days a week and twice on Sundays. But you did mention kind of an important aspect, though, is that you do a lot of cross-genre and genre blending universes.
I do.
So
yeah.
What tips do you have for some of our newer writers who are getting into, or maybe considerations or whatnots, these things you've learned along the way? They're getting into writing and they're finding that they want to write some of these
mashups.
Yeah, mashups. It's not like niche, but I was going to say just, these mashup genres.
It's very hard. It's really, really hard because, back when I was debuting, the thing is you didn't have shelf placement. I mean, Solus came out with that cover and people were literally like, we don't know where to put this. Like, it looks like maybe it's a romance and it's it came out in mass market paperback. So they were like, well, maybe we'll put it in with the romance books. And then you'd read the back and they were like, well, this seems like maybe it's more of a sci-fi fantasy sort of thing. So they stick it in there. And then some of them just like stuck it on end tables. Those who read it would take it up and have it in a stack. I mean, some people were pitching it to mystery readers and stuff like that. To this day, I have a reader base that is pulled primarily from science fiction and fantasy, but also from romance and mystery, like the cozy mystery reader base. And it's just because initially when this book came out, they literally had no idea where to shelve it. So, and that is a non-repeatable pattern, everybody out there. We don't get that anymore, even if there were the foot traffic that was happening back in the day. I mean, my book released when Borders was still around. So, whole different ballgame back then. But it's pretty equally difficult to do such a thing now in terms of how you sync an algorithm in a place like Amazon or whatever. If you don't comfortably fit into categories, Amazon also will hate your book and will not know what to do with it and won't be able to figure out your comps and won't serve an ad for you and all of that sort of a thing. And I know this because I also indie publish, and I recently did a sci-fi that was very cross-genre. And it just is really hard to get that in front of eyeballs because the algorithms don't know what to do with it, much like the bookstores don't know where to shelve it. It's just a different creature in the modern age. So I would say, legitimately, if you can not write cross-genre, don't write cross-genre. If you can sync it into some category, at least a parent category comfortably, then please do that for the book's sake. It's just more likely to perform better if both the algorithms know what to expect from it and the readers know what to expect from it. But that said, new multi-genres or cross-genres or renamed multi-genres like romantasy bubble up all the time. So it's also possible you could write a thing that happens to hit right around the same time that TikTok has decided this is the new latest craze that they love. And there are people like me who are like, yes, but romantasy from the 90s? No? Oh, we didn't call it that. Oh, okay, children. Fine. You and your sexy dragons go get down with your bad, not Anne McCaffrey self, and the rest of us will sit back and feel very old. Gail throwing shade. Which is to say, it can be done. It's just very hard to do. So my recommendation is not to do it. But if you can carry it with an additional thing, like high heat sex scenes or humor or something else that does have a broad appeal that will pull in readers from lots of different genres, then that is the other tool in your toolkit, is to pop it with something else that carries it that is also an unmarketable feature. So like it's not easy to market humorous paranormal romance, which is essentially what I wrote. It's not easy to market humorous science fiction or humorous fantasy, quite frankly. There are some leaders in that field, but they are few and far between. But you can use humor as a tool to pull in readers who may not have been willing to touch it, or based on some other perceived outward trope initially.
So I'm curious, if you were to comp your novels or your style to another writer, if you're talking about fantasy comedy writers, like Terry Pratchett comes to mind immediately for me.
Yes. Yeah.
Is there another style that you would say is similar to yours?
Now I tend to comp to somebody like Travis Baldree or even Becky Chambers more than anything else, because primarily what I write are found family comfort, like backbones. Now you can't talk about like voice and stuff with readers. They're not there with you. They're not going to carry it. That's not the level they're on when they're thinking about what they want to read.
Right.
It's hard enough for me to convince my own fan base to try me when I'm writing, say, sci-fi, because they're like, yes, but we don't like sci-fi. And I'm like, yes, but you like me. You like my writing, and it's still my writing style. Just try it. Try it. Readers, very difficult creatures to coax into doing what you want them to do. So my modern comps, I would say, is what we would call cozy. Because I feel like it also could be classified as romantasy. I mean, it is fantastical, and I always have a romantic thread in all of my stuff. So it could go with romantasy, but romantasy is being very colored by higher heat and higher sex scenes, and I actually don't do that very often, except in my paranormal romance, and those are pretty much sunk, like they're pretty much queer paranormal romance is a comfortable territory for them to hover in. So yeah, it's knowing not so much what publishing or you may think of that label and that genre as. It's what the expectations that the readers bring when they want to read that thing. And so, I tend to hang out quite a bit in reader spaces, simply absorbing. So I listen to like the Reading Glasses podcast, which is by readers for readers, just to hear how people are talking about the different genres. It just gives me a better idea about reader expectations and how to sort of gently manage them with the right syntax. And, when you're running marketing, or when you're writing cover copy, or when you're pitching out, all of those sorts of things, you want to kind of know the language that they're using so you can use it back to them. Because it's not the language that we authors use when we talk about these things, sadly.
No, which is probably foul on us, because it does make it a little like sets unreal expectations a little bit. But now we're pushing into like the business side of it.
We are.
Which is fine. I'm sure there are plenty of people listening that would love that.
Mean, when you market out your books, even if you're pitching it as a debut to sell to publishers or whatever, the things you are drawing on is your world building, right? Yeah. Like, especially in the science fiction and fantasy genre, the key is to stress how both what your book is like and how your book is different or unique or special. And for us, for genres that are part and parcel where setting is character, which is what science fiction and fantasy are both doing, the world building is what readers gravitate towards. Another thing I always say, and this is something that I think, again, is a writer conversation, but, I hope we're talking to writers here, yes, is that because of where we're sourced in the Gothics, what you cannot forget about when you're writing science fiction and fantasy is that we are also writing mysteries. It's just that the mystery we write is the discovery of how the universe works. So if you're writing science fiction, it's what do the aliens want? Why are the aliens here? How does the spaceship work? How, et cetera, right? Like and the readers are reading for that. They will give you a lot more leeway, especially science fiction readers, to use technological terms and to talk about how your faster than light travel works or whatever, because they know part of the journey for them is going to be discovering how it does work in your universe. And they're in it to be on that journey, to figure out, to have you explain the mystery of how your world building works. They like that bit. non-sci-fi readers are going to be turned off by that, but sci-fi readers are going to really enjoy it. And similarly with fantasy, your readers are there to be on the journey with your orphan who doesn't know how her magical powers works and isn't quite sure whether she's going to crack the system of the university that she's being forced to join because she has, accidentally exploded ice over someone's head or whatever, right? So like they're in it to learn how your magical system works, to learn how it's integrated into the culture of the world, and like whether that integration is correct or incorrect. Are we going to break the system? Are we going to establish the system? Those sorts of things. That mystery is part of the appeal for this reader base. Mm-hmm. So when you're selling and when you're pitching your book to this reader base, you better emphasize that part of the equation. I always think that's, at least for me, that's a huge part of it.
Well, so on that note, and you've kind of touched on it a couple times, and I'm glad we went this direction. But so you write hugs, your cozy environment, right? How do you go about creating or world building kind of that cozy environment for your readers? Are you really focused around the world, or are you just focused on that intimate environment?
I would say my stuff is pretty intimate. It's pretty closed in POV in terms of characters. Like if you were filming my stuff, a lot of it would be indoors with close camera work, people in conversation, like intimate. This is not Lord of the Rings style filmography, right? I'm not writing grand battle sequences or anything like that. We're not using a drone to film my stuff, right? It's not required. It's a lot more like you would be filming, I don't know, a sitcom or something, I always think, which means the humor in particular is very character dependent. The kind of humor that I enjoy the most is the kind of humor where one of my readers is reading the book in bed and is laughing so hard that their spouse is like, what's going on? Why are you laughing so much? And yes, sometimes it's a cute, clever wordplay sentence or a bit of dialogue that could be easily explained. But most of the time, the person reading has to be like, well, for you to understand why this is funny, I would have to give you the entire backstory of this character and what has gone on in the previous 3 books in this series. That for me is the best kind of humor. So the humor itself is kind of tethered in with all of the world building and the story structure. And that's where the comfort has. That's where the hug is. Like I want my books, even if it's the first time you're reading this book, to be a little bit like sinking into a friendship group where people know each other and everybody's kind of bantering and really witty with each other. But it's a friendship group where you feel like you belong as the reader, like you're part of this group. And they're probably going to hug you. Like it might be your first time coming to a New Year's party or something, but like you're probably going to get a bunch of hugs at the end of the evening, no matter what. Like they're those kinds of people. So I have a lot of like nice characters, like they're kind, fun, sweets. I write a lot of cinnamon rolls. I write a lot of grumpy characters, but they're like secretly full of love and affection, right? I write a lot of the journeys my characters go on is figuring out their place in the world, and that their place in this world is with these people around them, whether it's a group of, K-pop inspired singers on an alien spaceship, right? Or whether it's, a group of whack-doodle Victorian vampires and werewolves, right? Like them finding each other and being the quirky ones who find other quirky ones is the story structure. And that also primarily has to do with my own kind of relationship with the genre. Like I found my people through science fiction and fantasy and going to conventions. And I was like, this is where all the weirdos are, my weirdos, and yay. And going back to the same convention every year and seeing your people again. And so I kind of wanted to write that into my science fiction and fantasy, that experience of finding your tribe.
So were you a con goer prior to becoming an author then?
Yeah, I started with, so I come originally out of Star Trek Next Gen, create-a-thons. Those were my first ones as a teenager. And then I found my local science fiction fantasy convention, which was BayCon. And then I went to WorldCon at that, like all before I was a writer at all. I mean, I was a professional writer at all. I was obviously always writing, but yeah.
Yeah, that seems to be kind of a similar story for a lot of people. Like we have our different fandoms that we want to be a part of or have been a part of. like I was big into Firefly and
brown coat.
Yeah, I was big brown coat growing up out of high school.
Can I tell my brown coat story, please?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
It's gonna make you wildly jealous. So I'm a liminal brown coat, but a lot of my friends were like super into brown coat, and I gotta say I had a lot, like the brown coats got behind my book 120% when it launched my debut, to the point where Serenity had released on video recently or on DVD, and so the also bots were for Serenity and stuff like that, because I had so many brown coats buying my books initially, and this was back in the day before Amazon really had its handle on this sort of thing, and so a bunch of other brown coats from all over the world were there buying Serenity and then bought my dumb mass market paperback, and so to this day I have a ton of brown coat fans. It's charming, but my brown coat story is I was working on my first master's degree, I think it was. This will date me. I was working on something academic in the UK, and I was flying back, or maybe I was excavating or something. Anyway, I was flying back when the Serenity movie had its pre-release in theater launch that only people in the, I mean, K-pop does this for everything now, but back then this was a wild idea that they would air the movie like the weekend before, but only for brown coats who had pre-bought tickets and stuff like that. It was a whole deal. And what they were actually doing was sending out the actors in pairs or singles to go to all of these launch cities, right? But the brown coats didn't know that. So you would turn up at basically what amounted to a preview launch of this movie, and there would be one of the actors from the show in the audience with you. And it was like very exciting. And so I had a dear friend who was like a super brown coat who was like, you are going to come to Serenity. And I was like, of course I'm going to see. And he was like, no, you're going to come to this thing. I have a ticket for you. So I landed in SFO off the plane, and I went poodling off to whatever theater it was. So I was like 14 hours of travel or whatever. And he had saved me a seat at the very end because he was scared that I wouldn't like make it in time. So I'm like right at the end, right next to the handicap section. And I like sneak in and like I get there just in time for it to launch out. And this amazing smelling human being comes and sits right next to me at some point. Like while things are going on screen, and I'm riveted on screen, but I'm also like, oh, she smells incredible. And it is in fact Gina Torres. So I got to watch Serenity sitting next to Gina Torres. It was fantastic.
That's awesome.
You did just make Shady really jealous.
You did.
Yeah.
That's my graphic.
You absolutely did. Oh man. Yeah. Well, because then I followed it up by watching Gina Torres in Suits. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she was phenomenal in that.
Watched it before Suits was a big deal.
Oh yeah,
right.
No, it was wonderful. Yeah, it was such a great show. But
I'm old guard. I used to watch Cleopatra 2525, so that'll tell you how. And when she was in Xena, she did a couple of Xena.
I didn't know she was in Xena.
Yeah. I remember a little bit of that, but no, the first major thing that I remember her in was Firefly, and then just kept
You're
following
quite
her
a bit
along.
younger than me.
That's true.
So that's part of it.
Happens.
Yeah, I won't tell you how old I was when Serenity came out, but I was young enough that my mom didn't want me to go see it.
We don't do time math.
Yeah. We're going to be at Dragon Con in a couple of weeks, and Nathan Fillion and Alan Tudyk are both going to be there. And so we're trying to like look at our panel schedules and look at signings and figuring out like, okay, are we willing to go wait in line?
So I have never not liked anything Nathan Fillion or Alan Tudyk have ever been in. It's not happened. Yeah. Like I've never been. Yeah, that was terrible. It's always been. Oh man, I love this show. I love this show, or I love this movie.
I have to say, I don't swing. We're not going to say the phrase. I won't say that phrase. I don't use like celebrity clout, such as it is, very much. And the one time I have done it was to see the Firefly panel at Comic-Con, and I think it was like 2012 or whatever. So I have when you're a guest of Comic-Con, they give you a handler and stuff like that. And I was basically like, look, normally I wouldn't do this, but could you just get me into Hall H just this once so I can see this one panel? And they did, and it was great.
Nice.
But that's the only time I've ever really.
Nice. And that, ladies and jelly beans, concludes yet another week of world building here at Worlds Asunder. Thanks to Gail Carriger for delivering us a good source of information discussing inanimate objects, a little bit of business, and some of the fandoms that have inspired us. Thank you to you, the audience, for stopping by, and thanks to Nick Thacker and Book Career Network for hosting us. Links to Gail and wherever you can find her New York Times bestsellers are in our show notes. Make sure you tune in next week for Archeology and Treacle Tarts Part 2 and our next episode with Gail Carriger. Make sure you like, subscribe, and comment to this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And as always, thanks for helping us tear the worlds asunder. We'll see you next time.